There are moments in history where being born meant you were already losing. No safety, no stability, just disease, starvation, and violence waiting at every turn. And some time periods were so brutal, so unforgiving, they nearly wiped us out. These are the chapters in human history so dark that even the strongest of humans would perish. About 74,000 years ago, something happened on Earth that changed the fate of humanity forever. Deep in Indonesia, a volcano named Toba exploded with a force that's hard to imagine today. It was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 2 million years. When Toba blew, it shot out so much ash, smoke, and gases that the sky darkened across the planet. Scientists believe the ash cloud blocked sunlight for years. Temperatures suddenly dropped, and this cooling period is called a volcanic winter. It was like an endless, freezing twilight. Plants couldn't grow. Forests and grasslands turned gray and lifeless. Animals starved, and the food chain fell apart from the bottom up. Humans at this time were already struggling. They lived in small family groups and survived by hunting and gathering. When the volcano erupted, their world became almost impossible. It's believed that the human population dropped to a dangerously low number. Some experts think only a few thousand people were left alive on the entire planet. That's a tighter squeeze than any bottleneck we have ever faced since. Surviving after the Toba eruption was nearly impossible. There was less food everywhere. Animals died or migrated, and edible plants became rare. People had to move constantly, searching for anything to eat. Groups split up or died out completely if they couldn't find enough to live on. Many likely froze, starved, or fell sick as their bodies weakened. With the sun hidden by volcanic ash, growing crops wasn't possible. There were no wild fruits or roots to dig up. People had to rely on any animal they could catch, but those animals were hungry and desperate too. Even water became risky. As snow and ash mixed, drinking water could poison or sicken survivors. Those who made it did so by adapting. Some moved to places where the ash didn't fall so thick. Others changed their diets or learned to eat things they'd never tried before. This struggle lasted for years. Every day was about staying alive. If your ancestors didn't find shelter or a scrap of food, you wouldn't be here right now. That's how close we came to disappearing from Earth. Now let's travel further back in time, to a period when our ancestors were just learning what it meant to be human. Meet Homo habilis, a small, tough hominid who lived between about 2.4 and 1.5 million years ago in Africa. Homo habilis wasn't strong or tall. Most were under 4 feet high, with long arms and small bodies. Their brains were much smaller than ours, so they couldn't plan or think ahead the way modern people do. Still, they were special because they could use simple stone tools. This was the very start of human technology. But life for Homo habilis was harsh and short. Most of them didn't survive childhood. Even if they reached their teens, they faced dangers everywhere. Large predators like saber-toothed cats, big hyenas, and giant crocodiles were always on the hunt. There was nowhere truly safe. Trees could help a little, but falls were common, and injuries healed slowly or not at all. Their diet was a struggle too. Homo habilis ate what they could find: fruits, roots, maybe some insects, and sometimes meat. But they didn't hunt like us. They scavenged. That means they waited for bigger animals to leave scraps, then risked chasing away hyenas or vultures to get a bite. Eating old meat meant risking disease and rotten food. Dental problems were common. Broken teeth, infections, and pain were normal, even for children. Sickness was everywhere. With no medicine or clean water, even a cut could become deadly. If a child fell and broke a bone, it often meant death. Parasites, diarrhea, and fevers finished off many more. The cold, wet, or dry seasons brought hunger and thirst. Many died long before adulthood. Social life wasn't much easier. Homo habilis lived in small groups, always moving. If there wasn't enough food or water, people had to leave behind the weak or sick. There were no real shelters, no fire, and no way to store food. Every day, the group had to start over, searching for what they needed just to make it to the next sunrise. For Homo habilis, life was short, dangerous, and full of pain. Most never made it to old age. Every single one of your ancestors had to survive childhood, run from predators, and find food day after day. For them, almost every year was the worst year to be born. Jump ahead to the height of the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago. Earth was colder than almost any time in human history. Huge ice sheets, miles thick, buried North America, Northern Europe, and Asia under white, silent mountains of frozen water. If you lived then, your world looked nothing like today. There were no big cities or forests. Instead, endless plains of snow and ice stretched for thousands of miles. Sea levels were much lower because so much water was trapped in the ice. You could walk from Siberia to Alaska, but you'd be crossing a frozen, empty wasteland. Every step outside was a risk. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Temperatures dropped as low as -40°C at night, and even during the day it barely rose above freezing. Winds blasted across the open land, making it feel even colder. The sky was often gray or white, and blizzards could sweep in without warning. Finding food was the main challenge. There were no fields to plant, no fruit trees, and hardly any wild vegetables. Most plants were frozen solid or dead. You had to hunt for meat, chasing after giant animals like mammoths, woolly rhinos, and reindeer. But these animals were hard to find and dangerous to kill. If you missed your chance, you could starve. Surviving the cold meant learning how to use fire and build shelters. Early people invented clothing made from animal skins and furs. They built simple huts from bones, hides, and snow. Without these skills, people would freeze within hours. Moving from place to place was often the only way to survive. Groups traveled far to follow animal herds or escape the worst of the storms. They worked together to hunt, make clothing, and look after children. Being alone was a death sentence. It might sound strange, but the invention of farming made life much harder for most people, at least in the beginning. Before farming, humans moved from place to place, hunting and gathering whatever they could find. About 10,000 years ago, everything changed. People started growing crops and raising animals. This is called the dawn of agriculture. The new way of life had many problems. First, people stopped eating a mix of wild foods and started eating mostly grains like wheat, barley, or rice. These foods are easy to grow but lack important vitamins and minerals. Over time, people became shorter, weaker, and sicker. Bones became brittle, and teeth rotted from all the new sugars in their diet. Living in one place caused other issues. As people built villages, they started living close together. They shared water and food, but also germs. Diseases spread quickly. Simple sicknesses like colds or stomach bugs became deadly. With animals now living nearby, new diseases jumped from livestock to humans. Plagues and fevers appeared that had never existed before. Crop failures could destroy whole communities. If there was a drought, a flood, or a swarm of insects, all the food might be lost. People had no backup plan. Unlike hunter-gatherers, they couldn't just move away. Starvation and hunger were regular threats. Farming also changed society. Some people got rich by owning land, while others became workers or even slaves. Villages grew into towns, and soon kings and armies appeared. Wars started over land and food. People who couldn't work hard enough, like the old or sick, had little chance of survival. Cutting down forests and plowing fields damaged the land. Soil became poor, and farming grew harder each year. People had to work more but got less food. At the dawn of agriculture, people gave up freedom and variety for the promise of more food. But they often found life was just as hard, or even harder, than before. The change brought more people, new diseases, and deeper hunger. For most, the dream of an easier life was still far away. Let's jump forward to medieval Europe, the time of the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, a deadly plague swept through Europe and parts of Asia and Africa. It was one of the most devastating disasters in human history. The Black Death started in Central Asia, then spread through trade routes to Europe. The main cause was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It traveled inside fleas, which rode on rats. When these rats got into towns and ships, the disease spread like wildfire. But you didn't even need to touch a rat. The bacteria could pass from person to person, especially in crowded cities. The symptoms appeared fast. People woke up with fevers, chills, and headaches. Huge lumps, called buboes, formed in their armpits or groin. Within days, many victims died in pain. Some people survived, but most did not. In some towns, up to 60% of people died in just a few years. Whole villages disappeared, and cities lost half their population. Doctors had no idea how to stop the plague. There were no real treatments. Many tried herbs, burning incense, or strange masks filled with flowers, but nothing worked. Some people blamed outsiders or the unlucky, and violence broke out in many places. The Black Death changed society forever. With so many people gone, the fields went empty, and there weren't enough workers. Food prices soared, and the rich and poor alike suffered. Some landowners paid better wages to attract workers, while others turned to force and strict laws. Families were torn apart. Parents lost children. Friends and neighbors turned away from each other, afraid of catching the sickness. Churches and governments struggled to keep order. The fear of death hung everywhere. After the plague, Europe was never the same. There were fewer people, so there was more land and food for the survivors. Wages rose, and old rules broke down. It took generations to recover. But the Black Death helped end the Middle Ages and start a new era. Still, for those who lived through it, these were the darkest of times. Now imagine being born in the path of the Mongol invasions around the 1200s. The Mongol Empire grew faster than any in history. Led by Genghis Khan and his sons, their armies stormed out of the Asian steppes and conquered a massive part of the world. The Mongol warriors were fierce and highly organized. They fought on horseback, using bows and arrows with deadly accuracy. Their tactics included surprise attacks, psychological warfare, and terrifying speed. Cities often surrendered at the first sight of the Mongol armies because resistance meant destruction. If your home was in their path, life could change in a single day. Cities that resisted were burned to the ground. Men, women, and children were often killed. Survivors could be taken as slaves or forced to join the Mongol armies. Ancient cities in China, Persia, Russia, and the Middle East fell one after another. The destruction was complete. Libraries, palaces, farms, everything was wiped out in some regions. Fields were burned, irrigation systems destroyed, and entire populations disappeared. Some historians estimate that the Mongol invasions killed about 10% of the world's population at that time. Imagine that 1 in 10 people is gone, sometimes in just a few years. The Mongols also brought change. They opened up huge trade routes like the Silk Road and helped ideas and goods travel from China to Europe. But for the people who lived through the invasions, it was terror and suffering. Cities like Baghdad, which was a center of learning and culture, were destroyed almost overnight. If you survived, daily life was still hard. The Mongols demanded high taxes and loyalty. Many cultures and local traditions were wiped out or replaced by new rules. Families were separated, and whole generations grew up in the shadow of war. Yet, after the destruction, trade and travel did become safer in some places. Ideas, inventions, and goods moved faster than ever before. But for the people caught in the middle, the Mongol invasions meant fear, hunger, and death, making this era one of the worst times in history to be born. Historians call the year 536 the worst year to be alive for a reason. In that year, a strange fog spread across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. The sun looked dim, even at noon, and temperatures dropped. It was cold in the middle of summer. For 18 months, the skies stayed dark. Nobody knows for sure what caused this disaster. The most likely cause was a giant volcanic eruption somewhere, maybe in Iceland or North America. The ash and dust blocked out the sun, much like what happened after Toba, but on a smaller scale. The dark skies ruined crops, plants couldn't grow, and harvests failed everywhere. People went hungry, and famine spread. There are records of snow falling in China in August. In Ireland, historians wrote about a failure of bread that lasted for years. This wasn't the only problem. The cold and hunger made people weak, and disease spread quickly. Some researchers believe the first wave of bubonic plague arrived soon after, killing even more people. Society began to fall apart. There were riots, wars, and migrations as people looked for food and better weather. Trade slowed to a stop. Craftsmen, traders, and farmers lost hope as markets emptied and animals died. For years after 536, the world stayed in chaos. It took almost a decade for sunlight and warmth to return. Even then, it was slow and patchy. Recovery was tough. Many villages disappeared completely, and whole regions were changed forever. People who survived this era remembered it as a time of darkness, fear, and hunger. It became part of old legends and myths, stories about evil omens, angry gods, and the end of the world. Looking back, scientists can now see that one natural disaster can set off a chain reaction, making life miserable for millions. The year 536 stands out as a warning from the past, a time when Earth itself turned against the people living on it. The Industrial Revolution sounds like a time of progress and invention, but for most people, it was also one of the toughest times to be alive. This period started in the late 1700s and continued into the 1800s, beginning in Britain and spreading worldwide. Factories and machines changed the way people lived and worked. People moved from villages to cities, hoping for better jobs. But the cities grew too fast, and there wasn't enough housing. Many families lived in crowded, dirty apartments. Water was often polluted, and there were no real toilets or garbage collection. Factories needed workers, and they didn't care about safety. Men, women, and even children worked 12 to 16 hours a day. Many kids started working before they turned 10. The air was full of smoke and dust, which made people sick. Accidents were common, and there were no laws to protect workers. If you got hurt or sick, you could lose your job and your home. There were no hospitals or health insurance for poor families. Diseases like cholera and tuberculosis spread fast in crowded slums. Many children died young, and adults rarely reached old age. The environment suffered too. Rivers turned black with chemicals from factories. Trees disappeared as people burned wood and coal for fuel. Wild animals vanished from polluted landscapes. People barely saw the sun through the thick smoke that filled the air. Some people became very rich, but most lived in poverty. Wages were low, and prices for food and shelter were high. Landlords and factory owners controlled everything. Protests, strikes, and riots happened often as people tried to demand better lives. Eventually, things started to improve. Laws were made to limit working hours, end child labor, and clean up cities. Unions formed to fight for workers' rights. Public schools and hospitals were built. But all these changes came slowly and only after years of suffering. For millions, the Industrial Revolution was not the start of a better life, but a long struggle against poverty, disease, and dangerous work. It took generations of sacrifice and protest before the world changed for the better. Throughout history, people have faced times so hard that survival seemed impossible. From volcanic winters and deadly plagues to freezing ice ages and polluted cities, each era brought its dangers and heartbreak, yet humans kept fighting and adapting, finding ways to survive and rebuild. Today, most of us live with comforts our ancestors could only dream of. The past reminds us how far we've come and how much we owe to those who survived the worst times in human history.